Hi, and welcome to the second session for the Oklahoma Troops to Teachers JUMP Institute. My name is Dr. Brian Duke, and I am the Associate Dean of the College of Education and Professional Studies at the University of Central Oklahoma. I'm also a professor in educational sciences, foundations, and research. Today's session is going to focus on classroom management. And before we get started, I would like to ask you to pause the video in just a moment and make sure that you have some note paper and a writing utensil, because you will want to take some notes along the way that will be helpful in completing the form that we'll provide for you at the end of this presentation. So the format of today's presentation will involve you viewing this video and then pausing at different intervals to complete really brief activities. And during these activities, it'll be handy for you to have some note paper and a writing utensil available to collect your ideas that will be helpful later on toward the end of the presentation. When you finish watching the entire presentation, there will be a Google form then for you to click the link and go in and provide some responses. And these will be short written responses. I ask that for each of those written responses that they're 3 to 5 sentences only. Please try to be as succinct and state your ideas as clearly as possible. There will be a few multiple choice, true, false, those kinds of items. And then an opportunity for you to ask me some questions that you still have or to provide some comments about this presentation. You'll see the instructions provided whenever you click on that Google link. And the Google form is intended to last no longer than 30 minutes. So altogether, today's presentation should be about 2 hours total. And again, you have the ability to pause this along the way, to go back and rewatch segments as needed, but to do this professional development in a manner that makes sense to you. So let's get started with today's activities. And you'll notice that I've titled this session Teachers as Managers. And again, the focus is classroom management, but oftentimes we're not really sure what classroom management is or what that means. And so we'll talk a little bit about that definition here in just a moment. I would like to quickly provide for you the objectives of today's session. There are 3 total. The first one is I can create effective approaches for encouraging positive socialization and maintaining an organized classroom. The gist of this is that positive socialization and that classroom organization, and that takes real careful attention to how you've designed your classroom and the processes that are involved there. You'll notice under each objective that I have provided parenthetically an alignment to the Tulsa and the Marzano focused teacher leader evaluation models. Those numbers out to the side are the criteria from each of those models that each objective aligns to. So I know that session 1 this week you had an opportunity to learn about the TLE frameworks from J.C. Smith from the State Department of Education. And so this is just an alignment to today's objectives. The second objective is I can explain ways to manage instruction that facilitate student engagement and learning. So really being focused on engaging those students in the work of the classroom and learning. And we know when students are busy doing things that they're supposed to be doing, that doesn't leave them much time to be doing the things that we do not want them to be doing. And then the third objective is I can identify different forms of student behavior and describe strategies for responding appropriately to each. And you'll notice that all 3 of these objectives are framed from your point of view. These are questions or statements that you should be able to ask yourself. Can I do these things? Or I can explain ways, or I can create effective approaches. So going back to the first objective, we're going to focus on what do we do to encourage positive socialization and an organized classroom. And just for a quick note about the importance of classroom management, I want to quickly read this quote from the Journal of Educational Psychology. Hofstra University conducted a study where they asked 250 principals of secondary schools to rate their views on the causes of ineffective teachers. Half the principals were from high-performing schools and half from low-performing schools. Interestingly, both groups of principals identified pedagogical issues over content knowledge issues. Their top three culprits for ineffective teachers: classroom management skills, lesson implementation skills, and rapport with students. The least problematic issue they found to cause teacher ineffectiveness was content knowledge. And I like to start with this just as a reminder that it is so incredibly important that teachers really consider what they're doing in the classroom and have that pedagogy, that set of instructional and classroom management skill sets to make sure that they're engaging students in the work of learning. So as we think about what classroom management means, what a definition could be, one is that it is the result of what teachers and students do in the classroom and the school. And when we're thinking about classroom management, it's really similar to thinking about business management or construction management or any kind of situation in which we need a plan to manage what will take place. And if we fail to have plans to enact, and if we're not deliberate about really rehearsing these plans and making sure that there are protocols in place to see that they are working, or how to correct them when they're not working, then that's when we're going to run into problems. So in looking at classroom management, there are three thrusts or focuses that we will have during this presentation. The first is, how do we socialize the students to the classroom? How do we help them understand what is effective and functional social interactions? And then what do we do in advance to be proactive to prevent problems? And then the third thrust is, what do we do then to correct the problems? Teachers who have really strong classroom management plans that include ways to help socialize the students and help to set things such as rules and procedures and protocols, those teachers can avoid many of the student issues and misbehaviors that will require our time then being spent on correcting those problems. So as a teacher, what are the characteristics of a teacher who can effectively socialize, help socialize the classroom? And what we're talking about here really is this transmission of norms. You know, what do we expect as behaviors when you are in a school setting or a classroom setting? That's what we're talking about as far as socializing students. So many of your students will come from family situations or backgrounds or life experiences in which they may not have had models who have helped them to become effective with social interactions. And so we're really going to have to be careful and sensitive and explicit up front about how we integrate our students so that they are set up to be successful in that classroom. So effective socializers, here are the four bullets of these characteristics. And the first is that they are confident and they're self-assured. You know, you really do have to go in there with communicating in your actions and in your words that you know what you're doing. And it's to a point of confidence, but not crossing the line of arrogance. You still have to be warm and you still have to be responsive. Effective socializers understand what that appropriate teacher-student relationship is. And they understand that I'm here to teach students how to self-regulate and to take and develop responsibility, not to enable students. And so really finding a way that we can be friendly and kind always, but never their friend, so to speak, never crossing that boundary. And then effective socializers have positive attitudes toward being tested and challenged. We should see that when students test us respectfully, that that's a good sign of their engagement, and that we should respond to questions and and the challenges that they're facing by looking at that as an opportunity for us to advance our skill set and to support their development. And then the last characteristic here is obviously teachers must be patient and must be determined to be a problem solver and to be solution oriented rather than a complainer or one that expects students and the learning environment to be perfect. So one of the first things that's really important, but is often overlooked, is the need to really develop a sense of community in the classroom. The group of students, any group, this is not just students, but any group that gets together will establish their own set of norms and how they decide to treat each other. And that community can be deliberate or it can be something that just happens. And you want to make sure that you create a deliberate community, one that's supportive of one another, one that understands what the norms are, and that is based on ideas such as respect and success and the value of learning. And so in order to make sure that that is actually there, we have to be deliberate in including some of the things that are mentioned here in these bullet points. For example, peer acquaintance activities. What will you do to help students learn about each other, to humanize each other, and to see each other as valuable individuals? Um, Oftentimes there are icebreakers that are used at all levels of education, elementary and secondary. We need to make sure that what we're doing is novel. It's not something that they've done already several times in different situations, or in a secondary setting that they haven't completed that activity in 3 other classes that day. So try to find something unique and creative to you and your style of teaching, possibly your content area. Just think about ways that you can help them learn about one another. I've seen teachers who have made it one of the norms that students are required to use each other's names. And there's something really powerful about a teacher and peers using your name. It feels that you're known. It feels that you are, people see you, and it just really encourages students to feel that they are part of that community. We also should consider integrating team building activities, and oftentimes these can be done through the cooperative learning activities that are content based after the school year begins and after we've established that community. Building community doesn't take a great deal of time, but we do have to be intentional. So again, those activities the first couple of days of school, you don't even have to use a full class period, but just little activities to interact, to engage, and to have students talking to one another. And to have you as the teacher learning about your students, including their names. You know, there's research that indicates that the teacher really should know all of his or her students' names by the end of the first couple of weeks of class. And so teachers have to be intentional about that as well. And then with functional cooperative learning activities, I would say that just make sure to look. We don't have time in the presentation today, but look at what those elements are. They do include the fact that groups need to be selected and determined by the teacher, not the students, that all students need to have a role within the group. Sometimes there's the recorder or the facilitator or the presenter, or you could divide that, you know, you're responsible for item 1 in this project and you're responsible for item 2 in the project. Some kind of system that allows each student to develop an individual accountability for this project or this work that they're doing together. And then also there needs to be group accountability so that everyone's in the same boat with this project, that everyone is encouraged, because your contribution will impact other people. There are many strategies out there that can be implemented to do this. And again, today's focus is more general than this, but I do encourage all of you to look at functional cooperative learning strategies. It's different than just putting two people together and saying, get to work. That kind of group work often fails and it's often dysfunctional. And many of you have probably experienced that over and over again. So we really need to look at what strategies are in place to establish functional cooperative group learning structures. So what I want you to do is take just a moment now to hit pause and to look at activity 1.1. And I would like for you to take, 3 or 4 minutes and just jot down ideas. These do not have to be in correct, complete sentence form, but just jot down some ideas of, based on the grade level that you plan to teach or that you are teaching, you know, what are some approaches you could use to build and sustain community in your classroom? This is really, really important again, because without having strong relationships in the classroom, this will undermine everything else that you try to do. Your classroom management plan, your lesson plans. You have to have strong relationships in the classroom between you and students and between students. And if those are not there, then from the very beginning, you're kind of inhibiting some of the success of your classroom management. So pause, take a moment to provide some responses here. So hopefully you've had a moment to jot down some ideas. And at this point, we're going to move forward to expectations. And when we use the term expectation, many teachers call this rules. Some teachers call it behavior standards or norms. You can choose whatever phrasing works for you. But there are some guidelines for how we develop these rules or norms in our classroom. And the first is that we only have 3 to 5 positively stated rules. Only 3 to 5 rules, period. That's it. And that's because rules are intended to be global enough or big enough to encapsulate a lot of the expectations that you would have with behavior in the classroom. So instead of a specific action, these rules or expectations need to be things general, like be respectful, be prepared. And you'll notice in those 2 examples that I just gave, be respectful. It's positively stated. It's telling students what to do. Be prepared is the same way. What we want to avoid is using the word no or not. There's a tendency for all of us when we hear do not do something or avoid this, that it just makes us want to, the rebel in us kind of wants to react to that. And so, and it really doesn't help someone to know what to do when we just tell them what not to do. So make sure when you're creating these rules or norms that you're telling what the expectations are, not what not to do. It's important that we share with our students at any age the value and the rationale of having behavior standards. Elementary students are more inclined to be rule oriented and to look to the teacher and value the teacher's perspective. But as they grow toward those later elementary years into middle school and high school, peers become much more important oftentimes than maybe the classroom teacher. And so it's important that they know that there is a rationale, there is a reason that we do have these behavior standards. And once we develop these, or we develop these maybe collaboratively with students, or if we develop a set of expectations, maybe we give students a chance to suggest revisions or to talk about what the applications could be. But once we have had a conversation about the rationale and why we have these, we need to have students engage in the process of committing to follow these standards. And sometimes that's signing, having a class set of rules that everyone signs, or a poster that everyone signs, or maybe it's just, if it's not actually a written signature, maybe it's just having them verbalize their commitment. And then think about how these standards will be taught and rehearsed. So again, we can't expect people to just know how to behave. People have many different backgrounds and experiences. And so we really have to be explicit about, let's rehearse what these expectations look like. So how will you teach those? Will you have them consider what examples and non-examples of these expectations look like? Will you have them role play what these expectations look like? Or will it just be through a verbal conversation? So take another moment to pause here and complete activity 1.2. What will your rules be, and how will you teach and reinforce them? And once you have crafted those, I want you to go back and make sure that on item 1 here, make sure you only have 3 to 5 and make sure that they're stated positively. So take a moment to pause. So now that you've had a chance to complete activity 1.2, let's look at the next slide then, which talks about procedures, rules versus procedures. So we just talked about rules and that there should only be 3 to 5, and these should be really global, big ideas that should capture most of the um, independent behaviors that we expect in a classroom. When we're thinking about procedures, we're actually thinking about what processes, what protocols do we need to have in place in the classroom that will allow students to be successful and to demonstrate these expectations. And so when you're thinking about procedures, you might think about, as one example, a time when you've traveled, let's say on a commercial flight. And I would ask you to think about what are the expectations or rules whenever you are a traveler on a flight. What are the procedures that are involved for boarding, for seating, for exiting? Um, and why do you suppose these procedures are needed? Oftentimes it's for safety. Oftentimes it's for organization or the efficiency of the boarding process or exiting the plane. And how would those who have not traveled by a plane, someone whose first experience, this is the first time they're taking a trip on a commercial flight, how would they know what these procedures are? How would they learn those? And typically, if you can recall back, you probably witnessed these, or maybe you traveled with someone more experienced and maybe they mentioned something. So we can learn vicariously by watching others, or we can learn by others who may share with us what's about to happen or why we're doing a particular process. And then what might be the possible repercussions if someone doesn't follow the procedures? And in this case, we all probably have traveled on a flight where someone obviously wasn't paying attention to the protocol or waiting his or her turn to exit the plane. Um, so if we think about all of these different elements about procedures, about why they're in place and what the steps of these are and the rationale for having these and what the repercussions are, we have so many procedures in a school setting and in a classroom in particular. And if we do not make explicit to students how to complete this procedure correctly, then we need to understand our responsibility when they do not follow the procedure accurately. So what we do not teach and what we do not rehearse with them is part of our problem. So we have to be proactive in advance, and we have to make sure that we communicate and that we rehearse with students our procedures. And there are literally so many that you have in your classroom. And if we think about some of these examples, I will say for one, a homework procedure. What is the procedure for submitting homework the next day in class? Or if you're absent, what is our makeup work procedure? Where do they get the makeup work? When do they get the makeup work? Will you have makeup work available in file folders for them? How long do they have to complete the makeup work? Where will they submit the makeup work? And when do they submit that makeup work? So, think about all of the procedures you can have: restroom passes, a tardy book if they come in late. What will be the procedures at play in your classroom? So the research is clear for us about how we teach procedures and when we teach procedures. If you look here, the first item, it says a procedure is best taught just prior to the use of the procedure. So on the first day of school, we shouldn't teach them every single procedure they'll need in the class throughout the year. We need to teach them the procedures to get them started. And then the appropriate time to teach the procedure for getting makeup work might be the second day. We might model this for students who missed the first day. So we teach procedures as needed. We do this by discussing the need for the procedure and possibly soliciting student ideas for ways to implement the procedure. We don't have to do that. But we do have to do number 3, and that is having students practice the procedure. So we rehearse and we rehearse and we rehearse until the students perform it acceptably. And if we see that they're not performing it acceptably, then we stop it at that point and have them re-rehearse. I've often found that when they use their time, like just after class or during a lunch period or before school, that they are really keen on learning and really quick to demonstrate that they indeed can follow that procedure. And so we always want to then try to pay attention to see when the procedure is being implemented correctly, and then reinforce that by acknowledging how well students are doing. So what I want to do with activity 1.3 is I'm going to ask you to pause again. And I want you to think about a procedure that you're going to incorporate into your classroom or that you already have in your classroom. And I want you to list the steps. And when you list the steps, be explicit. Again, make sure that you are really, we would call this task analysis. Make sure you're analyzing this task step by step. And even hand it to someone else to look at if you have someone around to see if they could implement or follow this procedure as you intend. Because it's so easy for us to miss steps in this. And when you fail to teach the procedure exactly as you want it, then of course students can't implement it the way that you want them to do so. So be meticulous about thinking of these steps, and go ahead and pause and take a few minutes or so to come up with a sample procedure and the sample steps. So hopefully you have your ideas written down. And before we move ahead, I want to just mention that at the bottom of the screen here, I've included a link to a YouTube video. And there are actually several videos if you find this first one interesting. But this is actually a teacher. It looks to be middle school or early high school who is teaching students the expectations and the procedures from day one of his class. And you will see that all of these ideas that we've talked about are being implemented by this teacher. I believe this first video clip is about 45 or 50 minutes long, so this is for another time. But look at that if you're interested to see an example of this in action in a classroom. So what do we do when students aren't following the procedures, or they don't seem to be able to, in the rehearsal, to demonstrate it to that acceptable level of performance? Harry Wong, who gives great information about rules and procedures, and that's his specialty. He has a book out called The First Days of School, which many new teachers are given by their school districts, but is an excellent resource. But he would suggest the following questions for students. Can you tell me the procedure? If the student can't, then we re-instruct. If they can you show me the procedure? Then if they can't, we rehearse and provide feedback. If they can, ask them, do we need to practice the procedure more? Oftentimes, if this is on their own time, the answer is no. And then the big question, can you remember the procedure? And get that commitment on their part to follow along. I've also, just as an extra resource, included a short video clip, another YouTube video clip here, about Raymond Lodkowski's approach, the 2x10. And this isn't just for procedures. This is for students that we just need to develop that relationship with, maybe students who are difficult to us or are hesitant or reluctant to follow the expectations or procedures. This idea is that if we dedicate 2 minutes a day for 10 consecutive days with them, just paying attention to them, just trying to find a little informal way to share a common interest or to build that relationship, then you can see dramatic behavior changes in those students just by demonstrating that interest. So if you're interested, that clip, and there are many clips online, will give an example of this. So to conclude the first portion of this presentation, regarding the socialization and regarding the organization in the classroom, we're really focusing on 3 key points. We're focusing on building community, and we're focused on developing rules and expectations and developing procedures and making all of those very explicit to students as we rehearse them. And just to conclude here with a bit of research from the Journal of Teacher Education, regardless of their subject matter preparation, prospective teachers who failed to routinize discipline, or in other words, to make routine their discipline, management, and instruction, those teachers were often unable to focus on students who were learning. So if we don't in advance set up that community, the expectations, and the procedures, we're going to spend a great deal of time away from learning and on behavior in our classroom. Take a moment to take a break if you would like before we go into objective 2, or you can just continue to plow right ahead. So the second objective for this session is phrased as, I can explain ways to manage instruction, Kuhnen's approaches, etc., that facilitate student engagement and learning. So we're focused on ways of helping to really facilitate their involvement, their attention, their learning on the task at hand. And as we've talked about previously, remember that developing functional strategies really takes deliberate practice on the part of the teacher. A teacher has to be really mindful of what he or she is doing, and it's really, really tough. The first year or two, teachers are truly just surviving day to day, just trying to remember what to say and do with the content. But the more experience a teacher gets, if he or she is deliberate in his or her practice, then you can start to make changes in your own instructional skill sets and behaviors that will encourage students to be more engaged. One quote I really love here that captures kind of the gist of this section is, novice teachers tend to spend most of their time on what they are going to teach, when instead they should spend more time on how they are going to teach. So content is important, and you can pull that together and develop that in your lesson plans and in the materials you create. But in the classroom and with the students, it's about how you are teaching. So Kuhnen, Jacob Kuhnen's research, which is old, but it still stands the test of time and is part of the evaluation frameworks, gives us some key ideas in implementation here. So the first is called with itness. And with itness, this is where a teacher is aware of everything that's going on around him or her, and letting the students know that you know. It's almost like the eyes in the back of the head. But the way that teachers encourage that with itness is to make sure that the seating is arranged for easy surveillance, and to make sure that the seating is arranged based around the objective of the lesson, rather than just the aesthetic appearance of the classroom. So if you want to facilitate the attention being on a presentation at the front of the room, the seating should be geared toward the front of the room. If you want to focus on some collaborative conversation between students, then we may have them grouped up with chairs pulled together or around a table. Not all classrooms are equipped with desks that move or move easily or have the space to move. So the teacher, in whatever way possible, needs to consider, in what way can I most easily surveil the classroom? And then the teacher needs to move around. And I would recommend that the teacher be on his or her feet really all of the day. And the teacher should work the periphery of the room. And that way, if you're always on the outside looking in, you can see all of the students across the room at all times. Students can easily get into trouble whenever your back is turned. And so as much as possible, make sure that you are facing the class. Scan the room, let students know that you know and you're aware. And then when you're out working with the students, monitor for understanding. Don't just stand back at a distance or stay at your podium or stay at your desk and look to see if they're busy. Students can be really busy doing a lot of things that are not what you want them to be doing. So you need to be walking around and making sure that you monitor for their understanding. Ask them to show you how they're solving that problem. Ask them to tell you where they are at this point. And you should do this equitably for all students in the classroom. The students who are succeeding, give them an opportunity to explain. That's great for them, as well as the students who may be struggling, so that you can identify where that gap is and what the next step needs to be so that you can help that student move forward. With overlapping, typically you can position yourself in a room to where you can monitor 2 or more activities simultaneously. In the elementary classrooms, we often may have centers with students rotating to different centers to do activities, or we may have a reading group at a particular location with the teacher and the rest of the class completing some other kind of work independently. In a secondary classroom, we could have students who are doing paperwork before they get to move to the lab work in a science classroom. So whatever your setting is, just make sure that you have situated yourself and you've grouped students in the activities so that you can provide this overlapping. You can be aware and responsive to all that is taking place in the room. Additional ones are maintaining group focus. And with maintaining group focus, this is where we give cues and signals to help students stay involved and pay attention. If you think about questioning techniques, how do I change up my questions? And you can look online for different questioning techniques. But how can I change these to keep students engaged? I can call out a student's name and then give them the question, or I can call out several students' name, give them each a question and tell them you'll be back to them so that they have time to process. You could just ask the question and let everyone think and then call out a student's name. You could have choral responses. So there's not one question to use, one strategy. It's varying these strategies to keep students engaged. With Think Alouds, this is a way that you can help students to see how you, as a person with expertise in the content area, how you would think about the content and how you would solve the problem. And so an example of a Think Aloud that I share often is whenever I first started teaching at UCO, I would go out and work with student teachers, and I had a young man who was really a talented brand new teacher, and he was in his classroom, and this was a math class, and he had written a formula up on the board, and he had solved it for the students, and he solved a couple of more examples and asked them to chime in here and there, and then he asked the question we tend to ask: are there any questions? There were none. And so he said, okay, get to work on what will be your homework tonight. And of course, the hand started to be raised. And he went from desk to desk to try to answer these questions. The strategy I suggested to him is use a Think Aloud. Draw a line down the middle of your board. And on the left-hand side, I want you to put number 1, and I want you to explicitly think aloud and say, what would I do? What do I do? What would I do in solving this equation? And so the first thing I'm going to do is, and then write what that step is. And then on the other side of the board, go ahead and show the solution of that first step. Then, what's the second thing I would do? List step 2. Demonstrate it on the other side of the board then. Go back to the other side of the board. What's step 3? Then demonstrate it. Do this process until you've provided the solution. At the end of this example, they not only see a problem solved, but they also have a list of the steps. And this list of steps is something they can use to actually rehearse. And if they do have problems with understanding or not understanding what to do at a certain point in problem solution, then we can refer back to the steps to see where the gap is. So think alouds can be used not just a math class and not just for an activity that has a set of steps. Maybe this is how I'm going to approach this writing assignment, and maybe I'm going to think of some possible steps that I could use. Um, so any content area, uh, this will work. It's just making your thinking as someone who has some expertise um, visible. It's explicit to students so that they can see and hear your thinking. And then, of course, incremental steps, making sure that we break, to keep their focus, that we break the steps down in reasonable chunks. One thing I used to do with my students when I was an English teacher, I taught English middle school and high school for 10 years in more public schools. And I didn't do what was done to me, which was, here's a packet of really scary criteria about this big research paper that's going to be a lot of your grade. So that was so scary. Instead, what I would do is say, today we're going to work on this paragraph about blah, 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 blah. And then 2 weeks later, I may say, okay, after we've done this scene from Macbeth, I want you to pick a literary device, and I want you to explain how that was used in this scene and give an example from the text, something along those ways. The gist of this is that at the end of those several separate activities, we were able to take those and weave those together as a paper. I didn't have to produce all of the instruction and all of the guidance in the beginning for this big research assignment. Rather, I broke it down in steps to make it less intimidating and help them to focus on that task at hand that day. Once they build efficacy in writing and doing research, then you can give them the larger assignments and you will not have to chunk it so small. But in the beginning, that can help to maintain the group focus. You can also help them, have them talk to peers in small groups or partner really quickly about what they understand so far from today's presentation, or how they would solve this from their perspective. Just ways, again, to keep students focused. With maintaining smoothness and momentum, this is just making sure that we do not go down the rabbit trails, that we stay focused on what the task and the conversation is, and pay attention to your students. And when you see that their eyes are glazing over, is this because they've hit cognitive load, too much information for today? If so, let's slow it down, or let's turn it off and change gears. Is this because I'm moving too slowly and they're bored? If so, let's pick up the momentum and get back to the task at hand. So again, maintaining smoothness and momentum is a strategy. And then the final two for Jacob Coonan's work is managing transitions. How do I get my students to move from this beginning activity to the next activity to the next activity? If we don't have careful movement in helping them transition from one activity to the next, then they're going to find ways to disengage, and then we spend our efforts trying to re-engage them. So most principals will have an expectation of your students working bell to bell. This means when they come in, there's a bell ringer or bell work for them to get started on, a simple 3 to 5 minute activity. From that point, during that time, you can hand back graded papers, you can take roll, so that they're not waiting on you to do those things, that they're busy doing something for them to activate that knowledge that will be used in class that day. As soon as the bell ringer's over, they already have their papers back. You've already taken roll, and you can begin the lecture or the discussion. And then before you move them into groups, if you're doing a group activity, do they already have the materials there at the group? Have you already explained what to do when they move into their group so that they're not waiting on you for the explanation? So really thinking about what you need to proactively do so that students are able to move bell to bell, from activity to activity, and engage themselves without having to wait on you. The final one is variety and challenge in independent work. And just to make sure that you do have variety, that it doesn't become monotonous, that you do the same thing every day, every week, that is too much of a ritual, and that there is that optimal level of challenge in the coursework. You want them to push their skill sets and to develop problem solving skills and critical thinking, and but we need to make sure that it's not too far beyond them so that they are able to have success. Independent work, such as homework, should always be started in the classroom as possible. I would only give them 2 or 3 questions to do and then check it there so that they have some formative feedback before they go home to continue to rehearse. The sooner we can catch faults, the less likely they are to rehearse faulty approaches. So it's really important that we give feedback as formatively as we possibly can. And we should never send home homework that they haven't been prepared to do. So we're going to take a break now very quickly. Here's an activity 2.1. Which of Kuhnen's strategies do you think will be the most difficult for you to implement and the easiest for you to implement? So jot down a few ideas, take a quick break if you need to, pause this, and we'll continue again here very shortly. So we're moving into the third portion of this session. And the third objective is I can identify different forms of student behavior and describe strategies for responding appropriately to each. The research is really clear that if you have objectives 1 and 2 well implemented in your classroom, that 90–95% of your problems are taken care of. Now, of course, there's much more to it than just what we've talked about today. We have an abbreviated amount of time, but you have the gist of that community building, of expectations, of procedures, and then ways to keep students engaged by the way that you manage the instruction. If students, and students will, but if students demonstrate misbehaviors after you've set them up to be successful in these other ways, then how do I respond to these quote misbehaviors? So let's talk about, first of all, really quickly, why students are disruptive at times. And if you look at the research, many would suggest that it boils down to these really core needs or goals that students may have, these motives they may have behind their behavior. And one, Drycour suggests that there are 4 goals: attention getting, the need for power, to have some of that power and control, revenge, or displays of inadequacy. And when we're talking about displays of inadequacy, oftentimes students may act out or act in an undesirable manner to take the attention away from the fact that I do not feel capable of doing this, why would I participate and demonstrate to everyone that I'm incompetent or that I'm unskilled, when it is much cooler to my peers that I just look difficult or that I just look like I don't care. So those, the I don't care is a way of ego protection. But because of the feelings of inadequacy, then I'm going to display some behaviors that may be disruptive. So keeping those in mind, just have that in the back of your mind, because if you go down to this quote at the bottom, it says, so students are not bad. They're simply attempting to meet their needs using behaviors that are not in their best interest. And I think the sooner teachers can really embrace this philosophically at their heart, and they stop using words such as good students and bad students. Get rid of both of those. Those are judgmental. Get rid of good and bad students, and get rid of good and bad behaviors. Those are judgmental. Stay away from evaluating and instead be descriptive. So this is not a functional behavior. This is a functional behavior, or this is an adaptive behavior for this situation, or this is a useful strategy in this situation, and this one isn't useful. Those are more helpful, and students are less likely to want to fight back because you haven't used evaluative fighting words. So with this in mind, there are general guidelines for responding to unproductive student behavior. And it is one that students need to be aware of the rules and procedures. And if you haven't taught them and made them explicit, then you haven't done your job for them. How can they violate what wasn't made known? Or how can they be responsible for that? So if we want responsible students, we have to give them clearly rules and procedures to which they can be responsible. And we talked about that already with objective number 1. So what are other guidelines? Well, we need to make sure we give clear and polite cues to help redirect them. We don't want to get onto it. We want to redirect them as an initial, as a first response, and we want to help them save face. We never want to do something that is intended to put them in the spotlight. Adolescents are already feeling in the spotlight as it is. So we don't want to exacerbate that by putting them in the spotlight. We don't want to embarrass them. We don't want to go to sarcasm. We simply want to, our whole purpose is to help return a student back to the desired behavior the least intrusive way possible. So without bothering the class or disrupting the class or anyone else, we want to help this student or this group of students return to the desired behavior. So we should never use these opportunities where students are misbehaving as a way for us to be sarcastic or to be funny or to get a laugh from the class at their expense. Help them save face. If you do not, the research is really clear, and this isn't just students, this is people, this is us, that we will respond by fight or flight. So if you push a student and you don't help a student save face, expect a fight. And it may be a fight in the sense that they're going to resist you and shut down and not work, or it could be a fight to where they're going to become assertive and possibly even aggressive. So you, as the responsible adult, have the control over making sure that you remain clear and polite, and you try to help them save face. Be as consistent as possible when employing the consequences to your rules. And then help students understand, and it's never by being mean. Jim Fay, Love and Logic, we'll talk about in a minute, has a famous saying that we don't have to be mean to mean business. In fact, it's really helpful when we stay calm and polite, because when we get mean, we just encourage that reaction back with them. And so if we want them to calm down, we can't ramp up our emotion. To get them to calm down, we have to demonstrate and model calmness to get them back to where they can be logical once again. So we have to be careful on what we do, but we can have a conversation to remind them, that this is the consequence that happens when you choose this behavior. And this is a choice, and you can avoid this consequence in the future by making different choices. The consequences need to be logical or educational in nature. And I would say the more that we can just allow them to be natural, help them understand, when you yell at your peers, a natural response is people don't really want to work with you. And so let's work on you figuring out a way that you can communicate to where you can be respectful of your peers. And at the end on number 6, it says, remember that students want you to pass the test. You're going to have students who will test you and test your patience and test your consistency with the rules and test your emotion and your emotional savvy, because they have needs from adults that they may not be getting met elsewhere. And so expect the test, but do know that deep down, these students are hoping you pass that test. Many of these students need a reliable adult in their lives. And so when they test you, they're testing you to see, do you really care? Will you really be consistent? Are you really going to treat me equitably like you do the other students? And sometimes that means that I'm going to respect you enough to actually say you crossed a boundary. And students, if we're going to teach people to be self-regulated, they need to have those lessons. So we're going to explore just a really quick model here. And Thomas Gordon has what is called his model of teacher effectiveness training, TET, and he categorizes misbehavior or behavior problems into two categories. These are student-owned or teacher-owned. And student-owned behaviors are ones that do not prevent the teacher from teaching or other students from learning. These are really where students just aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, but it's not having an impact on anyone else. A student falling asleep in class might be an example. And think about, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to think about other behaviors that could be an example of a student just not doing what he or she is supposed to do. Teacher-owned problems are different in that these actually could or do impact the teacher from teaching or other students from learning. And so if it's not impacting others, it's student-owned. If it's impacting the teacher or other students, it's teacher-owned. So with that in mind, those two categories, we're going to take a break again. And I want you to, this is the last break for this presentation, but I want you to take a few minutes to create a list of student misbehaviors that you've seen in your classroom or that you might expect to see in your future classroom. And then label these behaviors as either student-owned or teacher-owned based on whether or not they impact others. So take a few minutes to do this, and then we will continue. So hopefully you have your list of behaviors with you. And I'll just mention that all of the notes that you've taken so far will be helpful as we conclude the presentation and you move to completing the Google form at the end. So again, keep those notes handy. So according to Gordon's teacher effectiveness training model, and this does come from a counseling perspective, so do know that, what are some appropriate responses? Well, when it's a student-owned problem, and again, student-owned meaning that the student's not doing what he or she should be doing, however, it's not impacting others, the teacher or other students negatively. So what should we do? And you'll see that I have kind of a behavior pathway or a decision tree here. And the first thing would be for us to use proximity. In other words, to move closer to them. And we do this while we continue to lecture or talk or while we're working in the classroom. But we just our physical presence can help redirect students because they know it's that with itness, they know that they're off task. And sometimes we may use other cues. I might just kind of look at them, might give kind of the teacher look. I might kind of point back to like the textbook that is on their desks so that they continue reading. If I'm walking by and using proximity and they still haven't picked up, I might actually tap their desk. I wouldn't touch a student, but I would tap maybe the desk or gesture to pay attention. So that would be our first level, our initial approach always. And then, and again, that's polite. And then we have some decisions, and there's not one that precedes the other. It just depends on what your fit is with the comfort of these approaches and what you feel the situation needs. In some case, it may be using an I message. And an I message is where we actually will state the problem and its potential impact on others, or that it could grow to have an impact on others, or the impact that it actually has on that particular student, him or herself. We could use active listening, or we could use the no-lose solution. And you'll notice that it says that iMessage and no-lose could also be used for teacher-owned problems. Let me give some specific examples of these strategies on the next slide. So we're going to move ahead. So with active listening, our goal is for the student to clarify and resolve his or her own problem. So as this strategy is named, it's active listening. We're actively listening, trying to hear the student. We can begin with, hey, I noticed this. Or as this example states, is there something I should know that keeps you from being able to perform this activity today? Or I've noticed that you continue to fall asleep today during class. Is there something going on? So we listen carefully. We really try to understand the student's problems and feelings about it. And we do this without being judgmental. We are accepting of the student's perspective. And so this is not a time for us to get into an argument. What we do is we simply listen, and we can ask them questions about, well, do you think this is going to have an impact on your grade if you continue to do this? Or what is another way that you can make sure that you're prepared to come to class and engage appropriately or as expected tomorrow? So we do this through questions of asking them rather than telling them. We want to, as we paraphrase back what we're hearing students tell us, we want to avoid providing solutions. It's theirs. They need to come up with their solutions. We don't want to patronize them. We don't want to minimize their problem significance. I've actually heard teachers tell students that, they don't even know what stress is yet because they're only 14. Well, 14-year-olds only have 14 years of life experience and problem-solving experiences, and they may not have had really strong models for that. And so we should never minimize their stress, their experience. We simply need to just hear them. And then we want to avoid diagnosing or trying to probe for deeper causes or take the conversation into some realm that we're not qualified. For example, if we aren't a counselor, we shouldn't play a counselor with them. We should just listen, ask questions to help scaffold their thinking and to try to help them find a solution. With iMessages, as I mentioned, this is where we try to help the student see what the impact could be on him, herself, or on others if it continues to grow into a teacher-owned problem. An iMessage basically consists of where we state the problem behavior and we state its concrete consequences to the person or the class. Sometimes we may even use the phrasing, I know your intent wasn't to, but the impact was this, this, this. Sometimes we can state our feelings about it. I really get disappointed when I see you this, what I need you to do is this. So the iMessage, the thing that makes it an iMessage is it often does have the pronoun I, but the big thing is that it's non-evaluative. It's not judgmental. We simply are going to describe the behavior and describe what consequences are likely to follow. And so this puts the ball in the student's court so that he or she then can make the next choice of where to go. Opposite of an I message is a you message, and that's often an attack, and this is where we're actually evaluative of the student. And so we want to stick with I messages. So make sure to pause if you need to, but look at these characteristics, and if we need to, we can switch to active listening as a student starts to explain why he or she is demonstrating this behavior. I have an example here to practice the I message. So let's say that several students have been talking rather loudly while you are giving directions for an assignment. You could say, when the noise level gets too great, students can't hear the directions, and either I've got to repeat them or students will do their assignments wrong. In either case, it is really frustrating for me. Is this an I message or a you message? This first one is an I message. So it's descriptive of the behavior. It tells the impact on others. And in this case, it shares the teacher's feelings. It's really frustrating. Versus the you message, which we don't want to use, but we hear often in classrooms. When people talk so loudly in class that others cannot hear, they are really being rude and inconsiderate. You should know better than that. It is so easy for us in our heads to go there. It's scripting that many of us have already in our heads. But the problem with it is it's evaluative, it's judgmental. And all that is going to do is pick a fight. And so we really want to help students understand the impact of their choices and behaviors so that they can then logically be in control to make some changes. The no-lose solution then is one of the last options with the with the student-owned problem. And with this case, it can also be used for the teacher-owned problem. What we do is we sit down with the student and we just follow this outline. We try to define the problem together by using iMessage of describing the behavior. Together, we generate possible solutions without evaluating whether they're good or not. We just get a list down. We then evaluate the potential solutions, thinking about, would there be unanticipated consequences? Would this really work? Is this something that's acceptable? Together, the student and the teacher would pick the best solution that they can mutually agree on. They plan the implementation, who is doing what, and when will these things take effect. And then we create an assessment timeline. So when are we going to get back together and see if this worked? Or daily, will we collect data to see how this is working? So again, this is an outline that you can take more time to explore as a solution. With the teacher-owned problems, these are ones where it does impact the teacher's teaching or other students. We can go to proximity and cues. These should always be used first as the initial response. Or we can go to direct correction. And then we might use one of these love and logic tactics from Jim Fay. And quickly, we're going to finish this presentation by talking about these strategies. So with direct correction, we communicate awareness and disapproval of this behavior. We don't have to be mean. We don't have to be ugly. We just need to be firm, eye contact and firm. And we state the student's name. We state the rule or the appropriate expected behavior. And we do make that eye contact with firm tone of voice. We avoid asking pointless questions like, why did you do that? There's not ever a good answer for that. And so we want to just quickly correct this and move back. So this is not the time for discussion. This is a time to directly correct it and redirect the student. We want to avoid making any kinds of implied threats, such as you better do this or else. And we want to make sure that we don't, again, escalate the emotion by being rough or abusive or trying to be meaner than they are. That's just not professional, and it doesn't work. So with the 3 techniques by Jim Fay, one is called the positive relationship, negative content. And you might want to pause and read through the elements, what makes it a positive relationship, what makes it a negative content. Read those elements and pause if you want to. But I'm going to move ahead with my explanation. So an example of this would be, and here's the behavior: I'm smiling, I'm genuine, I'm talking quietly, or in a calm voice at least. So that's the positive relationship. I'm showing I care by my nonverbals. And the verbal is going to say, I know it's no fun to come to a lunch detention, but you will be able to enjoy additional lunchtime with your friends as soon as you have submitted the missing assignment. So if the student is complaining about having to serve lunch detention because of not submitting work, this is a positive relationship, negative content statement. The relationship is still good between us. Unfortunately, the news is the same. You still have the detention until the work is submitted. So that's one approach. And this may seem intuitive or very simple, but if you really look at how many people will deliver consequences or talk about problems with misbehavior, they tend to go to a place where they feel like they have to be mean to mean business, and we don't want to do that. Another is called forced decisions. We force them into one of 2 decisions. The premise here is we need to make sure that we're okay with either one of these decisions that the student takes. So if we think about a current behavior problem, Mary's talking to another student while we're explaining the content of the lesson. And what are 2 solutions that I could live with? Well, Mary could pay attention and not talk in her current seat, or she could move to a different desk and pay attention there. Bottom line, she's paying attention. That's non-negotiable. It's just whether or not she is allowed to continue in her assigned seat or in a seat next to me. So again, I'm calm, I can smile, I can be firm if I want, but again, I'm not going to be mean. I might say, Mary, you can stay at your desk and listen, or you can move to the desk over by the bookcase so that you can listen without distractions. You decide. So we're giving control to Mary. Remember, we said that's what students sometimes need. They need power, they need control. So we're giving her control to make a choice, but the choice is still one we can live with. And it's a very effective technique with students. And then enforceable statements. This is where instead of telling students what they need to do, we tell students what we're going to do. That's why it's enforceable, because I can enforce what I do. So that's what I will tell my students. And again, calm, maybe quietly, maybe smiling, or maybe firm, but still not mean. I'll be releasing the class to go to the next period as soon as everyone is seated and materials are stored properly. I'm not saying you're not leaving. I'm saying I'll be releasing you. And there's a real difference there when you tell students what you will do, because they know you can enforce that. So if you take a moment to go back and study and look through these 3 slides, get the gist of what the elements are. I just want to say that they're really powerful, but it takes work for these kinds of statements to become your scripting. So you really have to be deliberate and say, you know what, I'm really going to practice trying to use forced decision statements. And you may even have to come up with examples and rehearse these outside of school, just predicting behaviors that you see that are common. And you need to rehearse this so that you're ready to go in and use this. Once you can effectively use enforceable statements or forced decision statements or negative content but positive relationship statements, once you can use those, it can change the dynamic and really correct a number of misbehaviors in the classroom. So for more complex behavior patterns, you might use problem-solving forms with students where they have to think about what they did, what they do differently, and so forth. There are many examples online you can download. Go back to that no-lose solution we talked about. You could investigate using some kind of behavior modification approach, which is beyond our time here today, but again, you can investigate that or take courses. We offer those at UCO in applied behavior modification or applied behavior analysis. Consider using a behavior contract with the student, but that's timely and that should just be a last resort. But again, there are examples of those in books and online. And then remember to really try to control as much as you can all of this, the management stuff in your classroom before having to send things to the office. A principal doesn't want to do your job, and managing the classroom is your job. And so it's really important that you put into place the things that we've talked about today, all 3 of those objectives, so that you have a plan and you have some strategies to try to work with and help your students positively interact and then learn while in your classroom. So what did we not talk about that's important regarding classroom management? We didn't have time to really go into detail about functional cooperative learning. But you can investigate that. Developing relationships, treat them like a bank account. Put a lot of money and investments into the account with each student, and not money physically, but currency. A lot of the social capital there. Invest in them before you ever have to take a withdrawal, so that your check doesn't bounce, so to speak. Parent and guardian relationships and communication, that's critical as part of your classroom management plan. So think about how you will include them and keep them informed. And then extreme behaviors. And again, that's another topic that needs quite a bit of additional time, but there are many resources out there that you can find online. So to conclude, I hope you found this helpful. Hope you can take away some practical solutions. Please let me know if you have questions. My email address is there. But the last step for you in this presentation for your professional development for session 2 is to go to the Google link that's been provided to you and to complete those short reflective items and the objective kind of quiz-like items. There are point values that have been associated there, but ignore the points. It's just for feedback purposes. If you complete these in a good faith effort and they're sufficiently completed, then you will be getting the full professional development points for session 2. So thank you for attending virtually, and I wish the best for your continued success.